Okay, we can probably get started. Today will be day 3. I already introduced the topic a bit, but um, we'll be going into Crossfire.
All right. Okay, so let's start with the purpose of crossfire and cross-examination, right? The main purpose is probably to poke holes in your opponent's logic or evidence. So, like when they're going to be saying some argument or something like that, you want to be able to like try to poke out flaws, maybe say that, oh, this evidence perhaps isn't correct, or that like there's some misunderstanding, there's like a gap in the logic here, there's like some wild leap that they just don't make the connection to. Another thing you can use it for is clarifying anything you may not understand or calling for evidence. So this really helps when like your opponent is reading an argument that you just don't have any clue what it is, or like there's just a specific piece of evidence that you want to see because you don't believe it. You can take this time to either ask them to like re-explain it in different terms or just straight up ask them for the pieces of evidence and they can send it to you directly. The next thing you can do is force them to make concessions. So the purpose of crossfire and cross-examination, you can also use to like just kind of get answers out of them, force them to adhere to something because everything you say in cross is permanent and is final, like you can't take it back. And so if you get them to make a concession in crossfire, then you can use that to further set up your later rounds, which leads me to my fourth point, which is to set up your future speeches. And this just means that like anything that they say in crossfire, you can use against them in future rounds. So just getting them to say as much things like as much like I guess negative things about their side as possible is beneficial to you in the long run. Okay, so let's talk about some general rules and guidelines for crossfire. So first up, cross is binding. I already touched up briefly on this, but basically all that this means is that if you say something in crossfire, unless you like really quickly correct yourself like right after, if you say something in crossfire, it is like what it is, right? Once the speech is passed, it's over, there's nothing you can do to change it. And so if you like say something
Oh, wait, is anyone else seeing him freeze, or is it just me? Because here I can
a complete
cover.
like just lie to
Okay,
like
Aiden, you cut out a bunch. I think it was until um
my bad, sorry.
yeah. You were
Um
talking about how it's after like it's binding.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay, so yeah, cross also isn't evaluated until you bring it up in another speech. So yeah, basically, like no matter what I get Harvey to concede to in Crossfire, if he doesn't bring it up in another speech, like his 2AR or something like that, it doesn't really matter. Like you just can't evaluate it. The judges don't really pay attention during cross. That goes for both Crossfire and cross examination. And the last thing is make sure you're asking a question. So a lot of people like kind of get this confused. They just try to like make a bold statement or something like that. They're just like, okay, so like your evidence is false. You know that like that really doesn't help them accomplish anything because the point of crossfire is to ask questions and like literally like it just doesn't make sense for you to make statements, but also you're not allowed to make statements in the first place. And so like opponents can literally just say, okay, that's not a real question. I don't have to answer that, and they'll just make you ask a question. So just to like save some time for yourself, make sure what you're asking is a question.
Okay, so I'll talk about cross-examination. So cross-examination is unique to LD in PF, which is what Aiden does. It is called crossfire. And what cross-examination is basically 3 minutes of a certain side asking the other side questions. It's this distinct from crossfire where both sides can ask questions. So it's 3 minutes each. It's after each person's constructive speech or their case, and there's 2 in total. During affirmative cross, only the affirmative can ask questions to the negative. No matter how much the negative has questions, they cannot ask questions. It's not their place. And during negative cross, basically same thing happens. Only the negative can ask questions. And this also just comes from, comes with its own like type of norm. So a thing you have to watch out, especially when you get to higher levels of cross-examination. Not only will their questions be much more difficult, they will have to ask you about things in your evidence, things you probably should have researched before. But they also, when you're answering, they will tend to ramble a lot, and this is strategic for them because one, they are able to basically rephrase their case. If you ask them a question about their contention one, they can basically just ramble on their contention one, basically just restating their case. And this is obviously very abusive, so judges do like look out for that. But it's also your place to basically interrupt them, say, hey, okay, you're like, thank you for the question, but you have to make sure you're being respectful. So it's kind of like it's a positive trade-off for your opponent, because really you don't want to seem rude when you're like interrupting them and saying, hey, like, you've talked too much. But that's like pretty much consistent with anything else like Aiden said before, where it's basically same exact rules, CX is binding, and you have to bring it up in order for it to be offense. To clarify on that, it's basically just like, even if the judge heard your opponent concede to something that he probably shouldn't have conceded it, that doesn't matter as long if you don't bring it up. So you have to bring up your opponent's faults in cross-examination. The best way you do this is just reference it. Just say like, my opponent conceded that this argument doesn't matter as much, or this impact is not that important in cross-examination. And a really great way to do that is, for example, I just did that, where like you basically just state like or you're trying to link your case into theirs and trying to point out any potential flaws into easy concessions. If they concede it, you really don't need additional evidence for it, which is really great for time. But Aiden will go on to Crossfire.
All right. Okay. So public forum is where Crossfire takes place. Public forum is unique, I guess, in a sense, because it's a partner style debate. And so each team has both a first speaker and a second speaker. So for Crossfire, there's typically 3 crossfires in a typical PF round. The first cross is between the first speakers of each side, so the first speaker of the pro side and the first speaker of the con side. The second cross is between the second speakers of each side, so the second speaker of pro and second speaker of con. And grand cross is between every debater in the round. And so basically what that just means is that instead of becoming like instead of just having a one-on-one conversation or like a cross-examination, I guess, between 2 people, it becomes all 4 debaters in the round debating and asking questions, answering, responding. And so it does get a little bit complicated. So you need to make sure that everyone's respectful and all like the volumes are very, very respectful. Because like with 4 people talking at once, it can get really, really hectic. Each crossfire also lasts for 3 minutes, just as it does in LD. Okay, yeah, continuing. So Crossfire is shared between both teams. So unlike cross-examination, where it's just one person asking another person during that time frame, the way that Crossfire works in public forum is that you have each team taking turns asking questions. So what you usually end up seeing is like one team will ask a question, and then after that, the other team will answer, and then that team who answered will take that opportunity to then ask a question, and they'll just trade off back and forth and back and forth. Occasionally you can ask follow-up questions like really, really briefly, but ultimately like you don't want to like seem like you're hogging up too much of the time, because that looks really, really disrespectful in the eyes of the judges. Now, your partners can't cooperate unless like they're in grand crossfire speech. So it's not allowed for like, if it's your speech, like it's second crossfire and second speakers talking to each other, it's not okay for the first speaker to just interject or the first speaker to like tell the second speaker what to ask. You can take prep time ahead of time in order to make sure that you have all your questions sorted out. But during the actual crossfire, you can't have your partners cooperating until grand crossfire. And again, that's where all 4 members are allowed to participate. And so the way that speaking order is usually the side that speaks first asks the first question, and the side that speaks first is usually decided by a coin toss at the beginning of the round. But that's only for public forum. For LD, they have predetermined sides. Okay, so a couple of tips and tricks to make sure that everyone understands how to do these. So the first is to make sure that you're really, really respectful. In a lot of cases, people have actually like lost rounds for not being respectful, because a lot of judges, especially parent judges, really, really want to see that debate is like a formal kind of event that like ensures it's diplomacy, it's talking things out, it's not really just one person yelling over another person or like interrupting things and stuff like that. And so even if you don't get like, even if you don't lose the round, or even if the judge doesn't decide to like down you immediately, you can still lose speaker points, and you can still lose like points for your conduct and points like that'll ultimately impact how well you do in debate tournaments. The next thing is to look at the judge. It's a little bit weird because a lot of people are used to like when you're asking someone a question, you look directly at the person. But remember, the person you're trying to convince in these rounds is the judge. Whether or not your opponent believes what you're saying doesn't really matter. It's all about whether or not the judge believes what you're saying. And so you want to maintain eye contact with the judge in order to make sure that like they understand what you're talking about. And so that you can also just make sure that you can analyze their facial expressions, see what they understand, see what they don't understand, and see if they're following along with what you're saying. The next is to try to avoid asking open-ended questions. So like Harvey said, it's a typical norm for people to just ramble on and on and on about their case. If you give them the opportunity to, most people will just try to stall for as much time as possible in both cross-examination and crossfire. So an easy solution to this is just to not ask open-ended questions. You can just ask a yes or no question like, hey, so like, is this true, yes or no? And if they try to ramble, you can just be like, I'm sorry, like really quickly though, my question is only yes or no. So yeah, just have them answer and have them adhere to the yes or no question, and that makes sure that you can get through the most amount of questions possible, while also making sure that they can't ramble on for their own benefit. And lastly, try to take up as much time as possible when you are responding. So this is kind of like the opposite of the previous one. So when you are asking the question, don't ask open-ended questions. But when you're answering the question, you want to be able to ramble on. You want to be able to talk for as long as possible, because not only are you wasting their time, you're also using more time to further explain what your argument is and to further kind of get the judge to understand your argument, and so that they'll be more likely to vote for it.
Yeah, and personally, I found like two main tricks or like types of questions that are really good to ask. The first one, especially when it's like parent judges. Parent judges, I know personally from like my parent telling me that cross is literally what like decides them. If they don't understand what's happening, the more dominant person during cross examination will win the round, and that's like pretty well known around. Like you try to appear very dominant while also not being completely disrespectful. A clarification on like the speaker points thing. Speaker points are basically points from 25 to 30, which the judge can give you based off of anything in the round. And typically having lower speaker points means that if you do not as well as other debaters, you will not make it to the next level. So if you have really high speaker points and you didn't do as good, it's more likely for you to basically win. And it's really important that you are not that you're not disrespectful, because in rounds, if you are disrespectful, they will instantly take off like so many points than other things. Like if you, for example, mess up, if you're not as fluent, they only take off like maybe a point or like half a point. But if you're extremely disrespectful, they'll literally take off like 5 points, like the entirety. So that is really important. But back to the two main points. So the first one I would like to ask is things like evidence, where you specifically ask for evidence. Hey, do you have evidence for this? Or do you have any time frame for this? Do you have a specific date? Do you have a specific author? It is really hard for them to weasel out of it. And a lot of them actually just go back to their case and they're like, hey, let me try to find this, right? And sometimes they do, but it definitely looks bad in front of parent judges and actual judges because they're just wasting their time, or they don't really know their case. It seems like they don't know their case. So even if they do have evidence that you think that they do have, it is good to ask those type of questions, because worst case scenario, they take up time trying to find it and they look like they don't really know their case that well. The second one, and it's pretty cheaty, but it's basically like, oh, like you say, oh, so you don't have evidence, great, and you move on to the next question. It is not really a question, but they can't really do much about it because you take up one sentence, and usually people are like, oh, no, we do, but sometimes like it really does help to become like, it's really dominant for you to say that, like, oh, so you don't have evidence, so you don't have a time frame, great, so let's move on to the next question. So it's kind of like a question, but it's not really. But I feel it's really strong to use in round. So it's just like, yeah. And next, we'll be branching off into our next topic of evidence debates. We realized we didn't cover it too much in previous lessons, so we'll go back to it and talk about how specifically we weigh between two types of evidence. And I guess Aiden can start on that.
Okay, yeah. So when it comes to evidence, that's like one of the most crucial parts of debate, right? A lot of times the determining factor can actually be one piece of evidence that just wins someone the round. And so it becomes really, really important to make sure that you know how to make sure that your evidence is the one that the judge is listening to. And so what we've accumulated here is like 5 main ways that you can make sure that your evidence is better than their evidence, and like you can explain this to the judge so that they'll buy your evidence over it. The first is going to be credentials, right? So this is really, really important. If your evidence is written by like some like Harvard graduate PhD student who knows extensive information on this topic, who's like studied this topic for years and years and years and has like a bunch of different like titles and has like done so many papers on this topic, it becomes a lot more believable for the judge to like buy your evidence over their evidence. And like, let's say like they choose something from like a Reddit blogger or something like that, right? Like it's very, very clear one of these people is more qualified to be writing the article than the other person is. And so in those cases, most judges will typically go for the more qualified author. The second thing is post-dating, right? This is actually one of the most common ones we see in public forum debate at the very least, and probably in LD as well. And it's just because post-dating is probably the easiest way to make sure that your evidence wins out. Post-dating just means that your evidence is going to be more recent than their evidence is. Say like someone takes the statistic from like 2 years ago that says like the economy is falling, we're nearing a recession, right? But you have evidence from this year saying no, the economy is rebounding, we're actually seeing large scale, wide scale economic growth. Then obviously your evidence should be prioritized because it's talking about what's happening right now, and it becomes a lot more recent than their thing is. This especially works really, really well if they have extremely outdated evidence, like things from like you shouldn't tend to use things from like before 2010. It just becomes really, really sketchy if you do, because those kinds of evidence like really, really get outdated, especially those about the economy. And so just make sure that you're using more recent and more up-to-date evidence. The third is indictment. Now, indicting is a little bit tricky because you do typically need some sort of evidence in order to indict another piece of evidence. And this like really works out in the way that like you have one study conduct like a report on another study, and they like determine that this first study is false or something like that, right? So if Harvey has like a study that says like, oh, like 15 out of 30 dentists recommend like Crest or something like that, right? And then one study, like I have a study that looks at that study, says no, actually they only analyzed 30 doctors in the first place. Like their data is completely skewed. They just don't have a large enough sample size for this to be true at all. Then that really helps my case because it not only disproves their study, but it also makes sure that whatever this study is talking about is much more qualified because they're able to like ensure whatever previous study like Harvey brought up is just not inherently true. The fourth thing is going to be the type of study. So this just depends on like what kind of study you're conducting. You need to make sure that the study actually pertains to what you're talking about. And so like if they're studying like teachers or something and asking them opinions on things like the stock market, it obviously doesn't make as much sense. And so you just need to make sure that the type of study that's being conducted is really, really relevant to what you're talking about. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense for you to have that study in the first place. And a study that actually is on topic will be prioritized over that kind of study. The last one is data, right? So there's a couple key pieces of information you need to know when analyzing whether or not your data is better than their data. The first is sample size, right? So let's just say that one person is choosing like one small city to analyze, while the other person is doing a comprehensive analysis of the entire United States opinion, like by taking like sample sizes from like tens, like dozens of different like cities all across the United States. Then obviously their data becomes more reliable because they're looking at not only a larger sample size, but they're also looking at a more diverse sample size that pertains to the entire United States rather than just one city where these statistics could be completely skewed. Another thing you should look at for data is the country. So if the resolution talks specifically about the United States and like they bring up a study from like Sweden or something like that, yes, it could be helpful, but you need to make the argument that like Sweden is like linked to the United States in this way or whatever like that in order to make sure that your study is actually believable. And in most cases, a study conducted in the United States on a topic about the United States will always take priority over these kinds of studies that are conducted just outside of the United States and something like that, right? So it's really, really important you look at the type of data that's being analyzed and that you don't just find any random study, but you make sure that you know what the study is talking about and how they conducted the study.
Yeah, so I'd like to just add on. First and foremost, a lot of these seems very obvious, but in the actual round itself, you are going to have to go looking, like go into their source and find all this types of studies. A lot of these other sources may just be they could just be a introduction and doesn't really have a lot of like ground to it unless you go into it and actually find the findings. Specifically on like credentials and post-it, a lot of things that I see personally that should be improved on is a lot of people will just say that, hey, my source is from 2020, yours is from 2019. That just means that mine is better, right? You have to attach some kind of weighing onto it. So for things like Things that are not things like climate change, economy, obviously those time dates really do matter because they change very drastically. Things like politics, but other ideas such as like moral theories often come from people who are like pre 2000s. So it doesn't really make sense for you to argue that your evidence or your ethical theory is more like it's more recent because all ethical theories really come from that same type of point. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the credentials. So a lot of the times, and I know this happened a lot with one of the authors that my school uses, that he was actually like, if you actually find out more about the certain person, so it doesn't have to be in the evidence itself, but you can just search who this person is. And what happened with my team is that one of our authors that we used was a very problematic person. He was like calling for like torture on like war criminals or something, and that was pretty bad because so what ended up happening is a lot of people just ran like theory or like some type of like it's like really bad to use this type of author in the round itself. And what this basically does is that it attacks the credentials of a certain person, but it doesn't really like, but you use it to weigh. So you're like, this person's credentials aren't as good, or it's an independent reason for you to drop them. Other reasons include a lot of these other like moral theories have authors who are very problematic people. Things like they like upholded slavery or something. A lot of these things you can call them out for, and it basically discredits what they said. Obviously, it could be argued that what they believe is not reflected in their literature, but it is always just really easy to make that kind of argument, and it's kind of like a game over issue because if you use a author that is blatantly racist, blatantly sexist, then it's pretty bad. Like it looks really bad in front of the judge, and it also kind of does impact the literature that they're writing. The third reason, like or point I like to say, is that the type of studies, or like the type of studies is it's important to also know like what concludes like what is a certain type of study, what is a good type of study. Sorry. So things like a really small sample size is not good, but also a really large sample size is also not good. It seems really contradictory, but it is something that you learn in statistics that having too big of a number is also really bad if you're doing the study in some like if you're doing a study on a population. So it's important to know what concludes a good type of study or not. And like if you take AP statistics, I really recommend it. That it really applies onto like what is a different type of study. But the most important thing I would have you guys take out of this evidence debate is that you have to weigh. Just saying that your evidence is like, or this type of evidence is better, it is not sufficient to actually explain why we should weigh your evidence over the other person. This often comes in types of like, for example, climate change, or a lot of these authors where a lot of people have conflicting views on it, even though like it should be pretty obvious. So it's important to weigh between why exactly your evidence being better than theirs matters in this round. Okay, so next we'll talk about evidence ethics.
All right, so evidence ethics is really, really important because this can actually like win you around if your opponent violates these kinds of things. So the first thing is kind of it. This one isn't as important, but it's still something that you should know, right? And this is don't paraphrase. So I know this is especially true in LD, but in PF, there are times where like people do paraphrase and it's still like accepted, but it's not like it's becoming gradually worse and worse as like people become more and more stricter on these kinds of things, right? And so the reason why you don't paraphrase is because when you paraphrase, it becomes really, really easy for you to mess up the author's intent. And when you do that, you're basically violating like the integrity of the card. You're changing what the card is saying in order to help you like fit what you want to say, and that just becomes like a clear violation of the rules. Debate no longer becomes fair, and so a lot of people and a lot of judges will actually end up downing you like for these kinds of things. That's why like in debates types like LD already, like no one paraphrases, and PF is starting to come around to that too. The second thing is no power tagging. So what that means is basically like before someone reads a piece of evidence, they usually like have like a one sentence, really, really quick, like brief overview of like what it means. And it's just a really, really short summary, right? But some people will take it a little too far. They'll like in their summary, they'll say like, oh, like this study concludes that like tens of millions of people will die. And if you read the actual evidence, it only says 1,000 people will die or so, something like that, right? That's power tagging. You're either amplifying and blowing up what your card is saying to like undisturbingly large degrees, or B, it's just like you're entirely like changing the intent of the author by just like saying, okay, this card says something when in reality the card doesn't say that at all, right? It says something completely different. And yeah, so you should never ever power type. The third is don't ever cut out words. Like one time my partner and I lost a round because like our opponents grievously misused evidence ethics and just like cut out the word not to completely changed the intent of an author and just made it a really, really important card, right? This was back before we knew that we should call for evidence and like ask to see the card if we don't really believe it. And that's something you should always, always, always do because there are people who try to do things like cutting out words to like power tag or paraphrase evidence, right? So it's important to not cut out words because like otherwise if they do get called out on it or like if you do get called out on it for cutting out words, you could end up losing the round by a judge's decision. And the last thing is just in any other way, shape, or form, never manipulate the author's intent to like change it and make it what it wasn't supposed to be. If the author like has a clear intent and you mess with it or you try to change it in order to better fit your own argument and your own case, that becomes a grievous violation of evidence ethics, and most judges will instantly down you for that kind of behavior. And next up is going to be addressing how to deal with these kinds of like violations.
Yeah. So just to add on a bit, so this is like evidence ethics have been a recent issue in a lot of LD debate. I remember a lot of my teammates just winning in like the first like 10 minutes because they called out. They see there. So we have this thing like before I get into this, we have this thing in LD and PF called disclosure, where basically 30 minutes before the round, it's generally a norm in a lot of high levels of debate to disclose your case. And what this means is you basically send them a link to your case, or you can send them your past positions, your basically what your advocacy is. Sometimes they also send the framework and basically what your main arguments are. And basically he had access to this case, and he won in like the first like 10 minutes, probably the first 5 minutes because he was giving a speech, and then the judge took a look at it off of evidence ethics because he called out what they say. And this is really effective because a lot of judges don't have a high tolerance for evidence ethics, and specifically it's like specifically it doesn't have to be completely misconstruing it, but changing it a bit to make your case seem stronger is also a point of evidence ethics, and they're all weighed the same. So if you can even point out that, oh yeah, this doesn't really say what it wanted to, and you call evidence ethics on it, most of the time judges will call you out. And this is just to better practice, like it's just better norms. We definitely don't want to see just terrible evidence out there, and there's definitely correct evidence that every single person can find. So it's just really important that you never try to misconstrue. And also this just applies in like daily life. Like you will get a 0 on your test if you don't specifically if you don't represent your author's intent very well. Okay, and how to handle I can go through this. So there are multiple ways to handle violations. Most of the time, it goes in the point of theory. And theory is a pretty it's a pretty advanced thing. You get into it if you go into high levels of debate. But basically, a theory is a rule about debate itself. So it contests whether or not the debate space was fair in the first place. Common theory arguments are on things that people run. For example, in LD debate, you can run advantages, and these are basically specified things that the affirmative is advocating for. So let's say on the gun control topic, they specify the topic to only being ID laws. And what this does is that if the negative has anything that is not ID laws, then they can basically say, yeah, that's not what we support. Like you don't address the case at all. You really have no office in this debate because that's not what we're supporting, right? Which is obviously very abusive because they can just specify any type of argument in the first place. And that's where theory comes in. And theory is pretty complicated. You'll get into it later, but baseline, it contests whether or not the debate space was fair or not in the first place. And this also comes in conjunction with this IVI, independent voting issue. It is similar to a theory argument, but it's made like a tinier one. Independent voting issue is basically a tiny blip that you say when you are you handling violations of fairness? And judges have a high tolerance for this, but for evidence ethics, they don't. So in this evidence ethics by itself, you basically make a theory by saying, hey, judge, you should look at this guy's evidence. It's heavily misconstrued. That's an independent reason to vote for them because they're misconstruing what the author's intent. And basically, you can just spiral out of control. Theory is mainly, a lot of people misunderstand it, but it's a story. So it is a story about You're basically crafting a story about this unfairness of the round, and you're basically making it so that it's try to be as persuasive as possible, but make it so that the judge believes you. And this leads to the third point about judge stop. Usually, the judge stops the round. If you win on the evidence ethics, then you win the round. If you lose, you typically lose the round because you taken time out of the debate to call evidence ethics that didn't really exist. So ultimately, the like violations. These are pretty high level stuff. Like the independent voting issue and the theory stuff is all pretty high level. Worst case scenario, if you don't really know what to do about theory violations, if it's a lay judge in the back, if it's a parent judge, it's really easy to phrase this as, hey, if you look at their evidence, or like you give them like the evidence, show them the evidence, say like this is really heavily misconstrued. Please take all their evidence with a grain of salt because we don't know what he could have changed, and that just makes them extremely suspicious, and that's just another reason for them to vote for you. So worst case scenario, make this as like a persuasive kind of thing. And yeah, so with this, we'll be going into a evidence comparison drill. I will send the doc after I'm done with this. And basically what's going to happen, we're going to give you two different cards saying pretty opposite things about nuclear war causing extinction. And what we want you guys to do is basically we're going to have maybe one person defend one side, other person defend the other side. Basically what we did yesterday, but with evidence this time. Okay, let me just attach it in the chat.
Oh, and while he's doing that, I'm just gonna add one thing really, really quickly. So, like we discussed already, the violations, the three ways to address it are an IVI, a theory shell, or calling for judge stops, right? But the reason why most people don't actually call for a judge stop is because if they're wrong, then what ends up happening is they immediately lose the round. Whereas if you're wrong, you don't automatically lose the round based off losing an IVI or losing a theory shell. Like you can still continue to debate the round even if you're wrong about them violating the evidence. So when you call a judge stop, you have to be absolutely sure that what they're doing is violating the evidence, is manipulating the author's intent, or something like changing the words or changing the intent of the author. And so it just becomes really, really important for you to make sure that when you're calling a judge stop, you need to pay very, very close attention. But judge stops are by far the easiest one to do. Literally, like just tell the judge you want to stop the round right now. Call in like a member of the executives of the tournament or tab room or something like that, and just have them tell the judge, evaluate whether or not this one piece of evidence is true or is false or is what they are saying it is. And if it's not, they lose a round. If it is, you lose a round. That's immediate. Like that's how judge stop works. It's really, really simple. And so if you don't want to learn things like theory or IVIs or stuff like that, if you don't like, because those are mainly in LD debate, then just go for a judge stop, and that's like really, really simple.
Okay, and I sent it. You guys should have access to it. It's two different cards. We'll give you 8 minutes to look over it, and then we will call on people, I guess, or if you want to volunteer, sure. But it'll basically be the same format as last time, just like debating each other. We'll give you times after the 8 minutes. Okay. So I just got the message. So I was in the restroom. Okay. Here's what's gonna happen. I'm gonna set up a speech drop. And this will basically introduce you to speech drop. It's a thing that a lot of debaters use to in like online rounds. And here, I'll make a room. And basically, you upload your speeches in here, and you just give them a link, and they can access it. It's basically like a mini website, if that makes sense. Okay. I swear it's safe to click. Like, trust me on this.
Is everyone able to access it? Just type something in the chat if you can't access it, and we'll find a way to do this.
Oh, also, it is very important. I think we forgot to cover it a bit, but in evidence itself, the most effective way uh, to compare evidence is through the warrants. So it doesn't matter how good your author is if he doesn't provide a clear reason of why the thing in the tagline says what it does. So, for example, even if there's not a clear link or a warrant in the card itself on why the evidence is true, or not like or like connecting the two different things in the evidence itself, then that's an independent reason for you to just like say, hey, there's not a lot of warrant here. This means that the strength of link is not that strong, right? Things like that. It is pretty easy to call out when there's no warrant. Usually you just say there's no warrant in this card, but also make sure you're doing weighing like mine has a warrant, and things like that. So what I want you guys to do in this card itself is just make sure you guys read it. The super tiny things are not really that relevant, but they could be hiding things. Who knows? So it's really important to read it always, and basically find out reasons why one evidence is just better than the other, whether that is the date, or that's like whether or not they have a PhD, or like their credentials, things that we covered already. But yeah, we'll be calling on you guys, I think, in a minute. Okay, I think we are ready to get back. Hopefully you guys have read the evidence, and I guess we'll call on 2 people. Okay, wait, it's here. Okay, so let's randomize this. I'll create the pairings. So first it'll be Pradeep Patel versus Shri A. At least that's what it says on your thing. So the first person that I called, which was Pradeep, will have the first card, and you will have 30 seconds to basically, I guess, like type out. We'll give you 3 minutes before, but 30 seconds to type out why your evidence is better than theirs. So same thing as this impact debate. Just explain in the things that we taught you why your evidence is better. Things can include their warrant, the specific warrants in the card that your opponent doesn't mention, or things like the wing. So things like Ice Age outweighs their like 2,000 times explosions, which means that we should care about it more, even if it does have a low probability. So things like that will give you 3 minutes to prepare. Aiden, if you can start timing, I don't have a timer. And we'll give you 30 seconds to post it and same thing. And we'll go on to the next pairings in a minute. So everyone has around 3 minutes to time.
Okay, that's about 30 seconds. So Pradeep, just send what you have in the chat. And yeah.
Oh, wait, no, and we're giving them 3 minutes to
Oh, oops,
prepare
sorry, my
first,
bad.
and then yeah, and
My
then 30
bad.
seconds to
Sorry,
send.
sorry. Okay, yeah, then
Oh, we also need to ask if you guys are here first and foremost. We just assumed everyone's here, but I mean, are you guys here? If not, we have to call on more people. I realize a lot of people weirdly left after we started volunteering people. I don't know what that's about. Okay, if you guys, if Pradeep and Shri are here, please say so. We'll give you a minute and then we'll just move on to the next people. And while that's happening, if anyone wants to volunteer, I promise we won't be mad.
yo, Pradeep, are you here?
Okay, I guess they're both not here. second group, William, since you're so eager to talk, why don't you take the affirmative side, and we'll just Vaman, if you are here, you can take the negative side. And you guys all should be like thinking about it while these guys are here, because the next person, we're not gonna have different evidence or all the same evidence. So you can use what other people have said. So make sure you're paying attention. It'll make it easier if you're lazy. Just like use a lot of the arguments that you'll previously have used. So William, you are affirmative. It doesn't have to be that long. It just has to cover some of the main points. Just say why the evidence is good. It's really that simple. And Vaman can rebut it after like 2 minutes of prep for both of them. Yeah, so here. Oh wait, like why your opponent's is not good, or why yours is like, first, why yours is good. It's always important that you start in your own offense. So why is your evidence good? And second, why is your evidence better than your opponent's? So talk about, hey, my evidence is really good. It gives this warrant. Theirs doesn't really give that warrant. Theirs doesn't really address Ice Age or whatever. And here's the reasons why the experiments are not valid. Things like that for the affirmative. Negative can basically say the same thing.
All right, okay, I think the 3 minutes are up. So William, you have 30 seconds to type out your things and chat. All right, your 30 seconds starts now. Okay, that should be more than 30 seconds. Yeah. So a little over actually. So go
Okay.
go ahead.
So it's fine. I won't make another person go now, but I'll just give it out. I just wrote a couple things down. So first, star 15, prefer my evidence because he is the director, he's a senior scientist, while the other evidence is just a PhD student, which means he doesn't even have that big of credentials. He's just trying to become a PhD, but doesn't mean he has any other credentials. Our evidence is really great about Ice Age. It gives good evidence about poisoning the biosphere and that the smoke would block out the sunlight, causing a radioactive fallout and making it too cold and too dark to grow food. Even even if your Elkin 17 evidence was true, and even if it was exaggerated, the Titan 2 was only used for tests. Obviously, we have way more bombs that we can use, and we can cause more destruction if we actually hit places that matter. And you say it's 2,000 times. Isn't that good anyways? We have way more nukes across the world than 2,000. Our huge magnitude means that we have to prioritize issues that are really big, because once it happens, we are dead. Okay, so that was just like a generic reply to the evidence. You can use Vaman, you can use like 30 seconds to reply to that. It doesn't have to be everything, but try to cover the points that I made. Okay, Vaman, there should be time. You can just put your points in the chat. The next pairing will be Alan Jiang versus Daphne Chen. You can try to say different things that I said if you were paying attention.